Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? Tonight we're stepping into the bustling, noisy streets of ancient Rome, not to walk among senators in white togas or generals returning from war, but to look at a very different, often hidden side of the city's life, the world of Roman prostitutes. This was a trade as old as the city itself, existing in the shadows of marble temples and crowded marketplaces. It thrived in dimly lit rooms, behind painted doors, and sometimes right out in the open, in places where wealth, desire, and survival collided. For many, prostitution in Rome wasn't just a profession, it was a way of navigating a society that could be both opulent and unforgiving. Some women and men were forced into it by slavery or poverty. Others entered the trade seeking independence, money, or influence. And while Roman moralists often condemned the practice in speeches and laws, it was an open secret that many of the city's elite were frequent customers. In this first step into their world, we'll set the stage exploring where prostitution fit into Roman society, how it was regulated, and the many forms it could take, from the brothels tucked into narrow back alleys to the high-class courtesans entertaining the powerful. The trade was as diverse as Rome itself. In Rome, prostitution was legal but carefully controlled. The state required sex workers to register with an official known as the aedile who recorded their names, addresses, and the fees they charged. This was partly about taxation and partly about controlling, attempt to keep the trade visible enough to regulate, but contained enough not to disrupt public order. Brothels or lupanaria could be found in almost every district, from the bustling Rome's most infamous neighborhood to the quieter streets near the city gates. Some were small, with just a single room and a bed. Others were multi-room establishments with painted walls, mosaics, and even running water. But not all prostitution happened in brothels. Many worked in taverns, bathhouses, theaters, or even on street corners, depending on their clientele. In the next section, we'll start to explore the different classes of prostitutes in Rome, from the lowest ranks serving the masses to the elite courtesans, who mingled with senators and poets. Prostitution in ancient Rome was not a single, uniform profession. It existed on a spectrum, with sharp differences in status, clientele, and living conditions. At the very bottom were the meretrices vulgares, the street walkers. These women, and sometimes men, worked in the open, often near markets, taverns, or along the edges of busy roads. Their services were quick, cheap, and aimed at customers who had neither the time nor the money for anything more elaborate. A step up were those working in small, hidden rooms often rented from tavern owners, where customers could drink and then slip away for more private arrangements. These establishments were usually dim, loud, and smelled of smoke, wine, and sweat. The women here had slightly more security than streetwalkers, but still little control over their clients or earnings. At the highest levels of the profession were the meretrices, honest, respected courtesans. They were educated, well-dressed, and skilled in conversation, music, and poetry. Their clients were senators, generals, wealthy merchants, and visiting dignitaries. These women could charge astonishing fees, not only for physical intimacy, but also for companionship at feasts, political gatherings, and private salons. Some became powerful figures in their own right, influencing politics and art through their relationships. Between these extremes were countless others, those working in bathhouses, where steam and conversation mingled freely, in theaters, where actors and sex workers often shared the same social space, and in roadside inns, catering to travelers. The variety was as vast as Rome itself, and a prostitute's life could range from desperate poverty to surprising luxury. But no matter their rank, all were tied to a common thread. They lived within a society that both depended on and looked down upon their trade, a contradiction that shaped every part of their existence. For a Roman prostitute, the day could start in very different ways depending on her rank, location, and clientele. A streetwalker might wake up in a cramped, shared room above a noisy tavern, the smell of stale wine and last night's smoke still heavy in the air. She would wash as best she could, sometimes with water fetched from a public fountain, and dress in the simple, revealing garments that signaled her trade. Those in brothels often began their mornings cleaning the small rooms they worked in, shaking out bedding, sweeping the floors, and, if the establishment was wealthier, arranging fresh oil lamps and incense to create an inviting atmosphere. Some would apply rudimentary cosmetics, rouge made from crushed red ochre, eye darkener from soot, or powdered minerals to highlight features in dim light. High-class courtesans lived differently. Their mornings might be spent in leisurely bathing, hairstyling, and preparation for the day's social events. Many had slaves or attendants to help with dressing, arranging elaborate hairstyles, and selecting fine garments. They might begin their day by reading letters from clients or patrons, planning which feasts or public games to attend, or composing witty verses to impress their next audience. By midday, the lower ranks were already at work, some waiting in the doorways of brothels, others mingling in taverns, markets, or near public baths. A prostitute's presence was rarely subtle. They were expected to make themselves visible, sometimes calling out to passers-by or using body language to attract attention. For the elite courtesans, afternoons could be filled with private visits either to a patroness' home or receiving him in her own, often beautifully decorated apartment. Here, intimacy was as much about conversation, music, and performance as it was about the physical act. Night brought the busiest hours for almost all levels of the trade. Theaters emptied, taverns filled, and the streets buzzed with revelers. Some women worked late into the night, their oil lamps burning in windows or doorways as silent invitations. Others spent the evening at feasts, keeping their patrons entertained until the last cups of wine were drained. And when the work was done, whether at dawn or in the small hours, there was the constant cycle of cleaning, counting coins, and preparing to do it all over again the next day. Life in the Roman sex trade was not just demanding, it could be dangerous. For those working on the streets or in low-end taverns, the threat of violence was constant. Clients could be drunk, aggressive, or refuse to pay. And with little legal protection, many women relied on the brothel owner or fellow workers for safety. Even then, help often came too late. The law might have recognized prostitution as legal, but that didn't mean society offered respect. Prostitutes were considered socially dishonorable, barred from certain public roles, and denied many legal rights. Their testimony in court carried little weight, which meant abuse or exploitation often went unpunished. Health risks were another ever-present shadow. Without modern medicine, sexually transmitted diseases spread quickly, and treatments, usually herbal concoctions or dangerous mercury-based ointments, could be as harmful as the illnesses themselves. Unwanted pregnancies were common, and while some women chose to raise their children, many were forced to give them up or face even greater hardship. For high-class courtesans, the dangers were different but just as real. Political intrigue, jealousy from rivals, and the wrath of powerful patrons could all end a career, or worse. One wrong move, one insult to the wrong man, could strip away protection and leave even the most celebrated courtesan vulnerable. And then there was the constant struggle against poverty. Even a successful prostitute could see her fortunes vanish overnight if she fell ill, aged out of favor, or lost her clientele to a younger, more fashionable rival. In Rome, beauty and novelty were valuable currencies, but they were currencies that devalued quickly. Survival in this profession required more than charm, it demanded resilience, quick thinking, and the ability to navigate a world where the line between luxury and ruin was razor thin. In ancient Rome, a successful prostitutist, especially one aiming for influential or wealthy clients, had to offer far more than physical intimacy. She needed to master the art of conversation, understand the subtleties of flattery, and read her clients as carefully as a gambler reads the dice. High-class courtesans often learned poetry, music, and dance, weaving entertainment into their work. They could quote Virgil, discuss philosophy, and gossip about politics with just the right balance of wit and discretion. This made them valuable companions at feasts, public events, and private gatherings, where their role was as much about enhancing the atmosphere as it was about personal pleasure. Even those in humbler positions developed specialized skills. Street workers learned how to judge a potential client in seconds, deciding whether he was worth the risk. Brothel workers became adept at managing time and energy, maximizing earnings while avoiding troublemakers. In taverns, women often doubled as servers or dancers, using these roles to attract patrons without seeming too forward. Self-presentation was key. Clothing, hairstyles, and even fragrance were chosen with purpose, brightly dyed dresses to draw the eye, elaborate braids to suggest refinement, and perfumes made from imported spices to stand out in crowded, smoky rooms. Some even cultivated a signature look that made them instantly recognizable to their clientele. But perhaps the most important skill was knowing how to maintain loyalty. A courtesan who could make a man feel both desired and important might secure gifts, financial support, and protection. For many, this was the difference between a short, precarious career and years of stability in a trade that offered very little of it. In a city where fortunes shifted quickly and reputations could be destroyed overnight, these skills were as vital to survival as beauty itself. The setting in which a prostitute worked in ancient Rome shaped nearly every aspect of her life, from the kind of clients she attracted to the amount she could charge. At the lower end of the spectrum were the lupanaria, small and often cramped brothels tucked away in the city's busier districts. These establishments were functional rather than comfortable. Narrow rooms with simple beds or straw pallets, dim lighting from oil lamps, and walls sometimes decorated with explicit frescoes to advertise the services offered. Privacy was minimal, and the noise of other rooms was constant. Some prostitutes worked in taverns, where intimacy happened in adjoining rooms or even behind heavy curtains near the main hall. These spaces were filled with the sounds of drunken laughter, dice games, and the clinking of cups, hardly romantic, but lively enough to blur the lines between business and entertainment. Bathhouses provided another venue. Here the mingling of bodies in warm, steamy rooms offered both opportunity and danger. Conversations begun in the baths could lead to private arrangements in side chambers, though the setting also brought competition from others offering the same services. At the opposite extreme were the private apartments of high-class courtesans. These could be lavishly decorated with mosaics, fine textiles, and imported furniture, creating an atmosphere of luxury and exclusivity. Clients who visited such spaces were not just paying for intimacy, they were buying an experience of refinement and escape from the crowded, chaotic streets of Rome. Fine wine, music, and carefully prepared meals might be part of the encounter, blurring the line between a social visit and a transaction. The space where a prostitute worked wasn't merely a backdrop, it was a silent partner in the transaction, shaping the mood, influencing the client's perception, and often determining the difference between survival and success. Ancient Rome had a complicated relationship with sex and morality. On one hand, prostitution was legal, regulated, and woven into the fabric of urban life. On the other, prostitutes were branded as morally inferior, their very existence serving as a cautionary example for respectable women. The state collected taxes from registered sex workers, and brothels operated openly in busy districts. Public attitudes were pragmatic. Prostitution was seen as a necessary outlet to protect the virtue of wives and daughters, a way to keep male desire from threatening the social order. The philosopher and politician Cato the Elder even argued that it was better for men to visit prostitutes than to pursue affairs with married women. Yet this tolerance was laced with hypocrisy. The same men who publicly condemned prostitutes often sought them out in private. Elite Romans could enjoy the company of courtesans without much damage to their reputation, while the women themselves bore the full weight of social stigma. Even freed women or slaves who entered the trade often found that no amount of wealth or influence could erase the legal and social mark of their profession. Religion also played its part. Certain festivals, like the Floralia, openly celebrated sexuality with performances, nudity, and revelry, blurring the boundaries between sacred and profane. At the same time, moral reformers periodically pushed for tighter controls on public displays of sexuality, citing the need to preserve Roman virtue. In this world of contradictions, prostitutes became both visible and invisible, central to Rome's social and economic life. Yet officially relegated to the margins, they were at once symbols of indulgence and reminders of the moral boundaries that society claimed to uphold. While most prostitutes in ancient Rome lived and worked in anonymity, a few became so renowned that their names echoed through history, whispered in taverns and immortalized in literature. These women and sometimes men rose above the crowded streets and dim brothels to become icons of beauty, wit, and influence. One such figure was Volumnia Cytheris, a freedwoman who began as a courtesan, but became a celebrated actress and companion to some of Rome's most powerful men, including the politician Marcus Antonius. Her elegance, charm, and sharp intellect made her a sought-after presence at feasts and public gatherings, though her fame also drew the sharp edge of envy and scandal. There was also Flora, a courtesan whose name became tied to the annual Floralia festival, a riot of flowers, games, and public displays that celebrated both fertility and pleasure, whether the festival truly honored her or merely borrowed her name. Flora's reputation as a generous and joyful companion became part of Roman folklore. Some legendary prostitutes were remembered less for beauty than for cunning. Tales were told of women who secured fortunes from wealthy patrons, navigating the dangerous politics of Rome with more skill than many senators. A few were even credited with influencing the outcomes of political alliances or feuds, their whispered words shaping decisions made in the forum. These famous figures lived in a precarious balance between admiration and condemnation. While celebrated for their allure and accomplishments, they remained forever marked by the profession that had given them both their fame and their infamy. Their stories reveal that in Rome, power could come from many places, but it always came at a price. As the centuries passed, Rome itself began to change, and with it, the world of prostitution, the glittering capital that had once drawn merchants, diplomats, and soldiers from across the empire slowly transformed. Political instability, economic strain, and the shifting tides of culture reshaped every corner of urban life, including the sex trade. In the height of the empire, prostitution had been regulated, taxed, and, in its own way, woven into the civic order. But as Rome faced internal chaos and external threats, the system began to fray. The great festivals grew smaller, the bustling markets became less secure, and the flow of wealth slowed. For prostitutes, especially those who relied on wealthy clients, this meant fewer patrons with coins to spend on luxury. The rise of Christianity brought one of the most profound changes. Early Christian leaders condemned prostitution not simply as immoral, but as a symptom of a corrupt society in need of spiritual reform. Sermons urged the faithful to shun brothels, and laws began to reflect this new moral vision. While prostitution never disappeared, remained too deeply embedded in the urban fabric, it became more hidden, less publicly acknowledged, and often pushed to the shadows of the city. For some women, this meant greater danger. Without the semi-official protection of the aediles and regulated brothels, more sex work happened in unmonitored spaces, back alleys, private rooms, and remote taverns where violence and exploitation were harder to prevent. Yet for others, the shift brought opportunity. Private arrangements with discreet, loyal patrons replaced the public spectacle of the trade, creating new forms of survival in a harsher moral climate. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell, the image of the Roman prostitute had changed dramatically. No longer a visible and accepted if stigmatized part of public life, she became a shadowy figure in the stories and memories of the city, a relic of a more permissive and worldly age. The reality of a prostitute's life in ancient Rome was often far different from the way it was described in literature, satire, and public speeches. Writers, poets, and moralists tended to mold these women into symbols, sometimes seductive, sometimes shameful, depending on the lesson they wished to teach, or the story they wanted to tell. In the comedies of Plautus and Terence, prostitutes were often portrayed as clever and quick-witted, using their charm to outsmart wealthy but foolish men. These stage versions bore little resemblance to the harsh day-to-day reality of most sex workers, but they reflected Rome's fascination with the idea of the dangerous woman who could turn the tables on her clients. Satirists like Juvenal and Martial used prostitutes as easy targets in their biting commentaries, painting them as embodiments of moral decay. Their words dripped with mockery, sometimes exaggerating behaviors for comedic effect, sometimes to rally the public against what they saw as the erosion of traditional Roman values. Meanwhile, love poets such as Ovid and Propertius could be far more romantic. In their verses, courtesans became muses mysterious, desirable, and capable of inspiring deep passion. Yet even here, reality was blurred. The courtesan in poetry was often an idealized composite, shaped by fantasy and the needs of the poet's art, rather than an actual woman with a life and struggles of her own. Moralists and lawmakers added yet another layer, framing prostitution as both a threat to family honor and a necessary evil to maintain social order. This contradiction meant that public opinion could swing wildly depending on the audience and the moment. Through all these portrayals, the voices of the prostitutes themselves were almost never heard directly. What survives of their world comes filtered through the perspectives of men, clients, critics, and creators, leaving us to read between the lines, to glimpse the human beings behind the caricatures. While literature often distorted or romanticized the lives of Roman prostitutes, archaeology offers us a far more direct and sometimes startlingly intimate glimpse into their reality. In the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum cities frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, evidence of the trade survives, not in lofty verse, but in stone, paint, and casual graffiti. The Lupanaria of Pompeii still stand, their small rooms lined along narrow corridors, each with a built-in stone bed that once held a mattress or straw. On the walls, vivid frescoes depict explicit scenes, not so much for decoration as for advertising, showing prospective clients the services available. These paintings are unapologetically direct, a reminder that in this context, sex was a commercial transaction with clear expectations. Perhaps most revealing are the inscriptions scratched into the plaster. Some are crude boasts left by clients, others are affectionate notes or playful taunts between workers. Names appear again and again. Mitis was here. Successus loves Iris, turning anonymous figures into individuals with histories and relationships. These scrawled messages give us rare fragments of the personalities behind the profession, unfiltered by poets or archaeologists have also uncovered small artifacts, bronze oil lamps shaped like erotic figures, cosmetic containers still holding traces of pigment, and coins lost between floorboards, perhaps dropped in the rush of a hurried encounter. Each object speaks of a moment in time, a small but tangible piece of a life lived in the shadows of Roman society. Together, these remnants remind us that beyond the stereotypes and moral judgments, these women and men were real people working, surviving, laughing, and leaving behind marks that, against all odds, have endured for nearly 2,000 years. As the centuries turned and the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the social and moral landscape of Europe shifted dramatically. The rise of Christianity brought with it a new and deeply moralized view of sexuality, one that would redefine, and in many ways diminish, the tolerated space prostitution had once occupied in Roman life. In the pagan Roman world, prostitution had been seen as a pragmatic, if morally questionable, outlet. It was regulated, taxed, and in some contexts, even woven into festivals and public life. But Christian doctrine recast the trade not as a necessary public service, but as a moral failing both for those who sold sex and for those who purchased it. Church fathers such as Augustine and Jerome spoke of prostitutes in terms of repentance and salvation, framing them as sinners who could be redeemed, but who also served as a cautionary warning. While some bishops acknowledged that the existence of prostitutes might prevent greater evils, echoing the old Roman pragmatism, the tone was increasingly one of condemnation rather than regulation. Laws began to reflect this shift. In many Christianized cities, brothels were pushed to the outskirts or closed entirely. Public displays of sexual commerce were suppressed, and those caught soliciting could face fines, public penance, or even exile. This did not eliminate prostitution, far from it, but it drove the trade deeper into secrecy, stripping away some of the legal protections that Roman sex workers had once enjoyed. For the women themselves, this transition was dangerous. Without official registration or oversight, they became more vulnerable to exploitation and violence. At the same time, Christian charitable institutions occasionally offered paths out of the trade, placing repentant women in convents or shelters. In this new world, prostitution was no longer a tolerated profession. On the margins of respectable society, it was a moral problem to be eradicated, or at least hidden from view. The echoes of this transformation would shape attitudes toward sex work for centuries to come, long after the last remnants of the Roman Empire had faded. When the Roman Empire was gone, the reality of its sex trade didn't simply vanish, it was transformed into legend, moral tale, and artistic inspiration. Over the centuries, the image of the Roman prostitute was reshaped by the pens of historians, the brushes of painters, and the sermons of preachers. Medieval chroniclers often wrote about them with a mixture of fascination and moral warning, casting them as symbols of the decadence that had supposedly brought down the empire. In these accounts, prostitutes became part of a broader narrative about Roman excess alongside lavish banquets, corrupt politicians, and crumbling morals. Whether accurate or not, the message was clear. Sexual indulgence was a sign of societal decay. Renaissance artists and humanists took a different approach. Fascinated by antiquity, they depicted Roman courtesans as exotic, sensual, and often glamorous figures. Paintings showed them reclining in marble courtyards, draped in silk, their beauty elevated almost to the level of myth. Poets borrowed their names and wove them into verses about love, power, and betrayal, more muse than moral example. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the prostitute of ancient Rome had become a cultural archetype, appearing in plays, operas, and novels. Sometimes she was portrayed as a victim of circumstance, other times as a clever manipulator who could outwit men of higher status. Historical accuracy mattered less than the emotional or moral impact of the story. Even in modern scholarship, the image of the Roman sex worker is shaped by both evidence and imagination. Archaeological finds from brothel frescoes in Pompeii to wax tablets recording payments offer glimpses of reality, while ancient literature provides voices that are often filtered through male, elite perspectives. The result is a portrait that is vivid but incomplete, a blend of fact, fiction, and enduring fascination. In the end, the Roman prostitute lives on not only in history books, but in the cultural imagination, sometimes condemned, sometimes celebrated, and always surrounded by the aura of a world long gone yet strangely familiar. Though centuries separate us from the streets of ancient Rome, echoes of its sex trade can still be felt today. The same tensions between legality and stigma, desire and morality, exploitation and autonomy continue to shape how societies view and regulate sex work. Modern debates over legalization, workers' rights, and public morality bear a striking resemblance to Roman discussions, even if the language and cultural framework have changed. Ancient Rome's pragmatic acceptance of prostitution, coupled with its moral double standards, finds parallels in many parts of the contemporary world. Laws may differ, but the underlying contradictions remain. The figure of the courtesan or sex worker as both marginalized and influential also persists. In some ways, the high-class courtesans of Rome were forerunners of modern celebrity culture, individuals whose allure, charisma, and personal brand could translate into real power. Today, similar dynamics play out in media, entertainment, and online spaces, where public fascination with sexuality is matched by ongoing social judgment. Archaeology and historical study keep shedding light on the lived experiences of these women and men, reminding us that they were not just symbols or moral examples, they were people navigating difficult choices in a world with limited options. They laughed, bargained, loved, and struggled, just as individuals in the same profession do today. From the dim corridors of the lupernaria to the candlelit chambers of high-class courtesans, prostitution in ancient Rome was a constant presence, a thread woven through the city's economy, culture, and private lives. It was at once public and hidden, accepted and condemned, empowering and exploitative. To study it is to confront the contradictions not just of Rome, but of human society itself, the way pleasure and judgment, necessity and morality, can exist side by side. While the empire has long since fallen, the stories of these women and men still speak to us not only as a record of the past, but as a mirror reflecting issues we continue to wrestle with today. In their world, as in ours, the line between respectability and scandal was thin, easily crossed, and often drawn by those in power, and so, the Roman prostitute remains an enduring figure of history, myth, and humanity's complicated relationship with desire.